All right, we're live. Hi, everybody. Welcome to Ben's Roundtable. I'm Jayatri Das, Chief Bioscientist here at the Franklin Institute, and I'm joined by our Chief Astronomer, Derek Pitts, and our Senior VP of Science and Education and Resident Engineer, Daryl Williams. So we're here just like Ben Franklin and his friends used to get together. We're here to look at some of the interesting science stories in the headlines and talk about our most informed hot takes. So, science is always changing, and we're here to help you make sense of what's coming up the pike and how it all makes sense for our lives. Now, although you may know that Boston has always held a bit of a grudge against Philadelphia because Ben Franklin left Boston to come to Philly, they have gone a bit of retribution now because our former colleague, environmental scientist Rachel Valletta, has gone back north, back to her Boston roots. So we will miss her. But we're delighted that you are here to join in our conversation. So send us your questions, your ideas, and your interests for future conversations as well. So I think I'm up first this time around. So I'm just going to start my timer here so you can keep track of how long we're talking for. And I'm up first because there is a really exciting development in global public health, which is a new malaria vaccine that's been approved by the World Health Organization. So let's just lay a little bit of groundwork for why this is such a landmark accomplishment. Malaria is a disease that kills hundreds and thousands of people across the world, especially children. And it's been really, really hard to develop a vaccine for malaria because it's particularly complicated. We've been talking about vaccines a lot with COVID-19, but COVID-19 is caused by a pretty simple virus. We sequenced the genome of this virus in like a day, right? But malaria is caused by a parasite that is a much more complex organism. It has a complex life cycle. And so it's really been a challenge to develop a vaccine. And this is the first vaccine that's really been tested on a lot of people, but there are questions about the fact that it's only about 30% effective. And so while this is a huge accomplishment, where do we really stand? How far does it get us in the global fight against malaria?
Wow, only 30% effective?
Right. Yeah, when you look at sort of the protection against sort of that deadly severe disease, it's between 30 and 40%. So, we've all been looking at COVID-19 vaccines and looking at vaccines in like the 90% effectiveness. So, it's from a scientific point of view, it's amazing, right? Because we've been trying so hard for so long to work on this problem, but how can we do better, right?
Well, and thank you for bringing this topic up, Judge. I think this is fascinating. You hit the nail on the head initially, right, with the significance of where we are with this particular treatment. But I'm also curious too. We're having these conversations now with the COVID vaccine, which has way more efficacy, but then the conversations around boosters for older populations and the immunocompromised populations. And so my question really to you all, and even to those outside watching, is does this then mean that there is going to be some regularity in terms of how often people would have to get boosters, malaria boosters? And also too, is this at a place where it's ready to be rolled out, or is this more of a we've established that we can create a said vaccine, but we recognize that we need to do more in order to make it more efficacious?
Yeah, so that's a good question, because malaria, when it comes to getting infected naturally, it's something that we know that your immunity does not last for a lifetime. You can get it, you can get infected again. In fact, I remember when I was a kid, my dad got malaria and he got it times. So this is something that really stands out for me in remembering how that affected my dad. And so that's been one of the challenges, is because the normal infection process of the parasite actually suppresses your immune system. So it's kind of like a double whammy. So the dosage course for this vaccine really starts young. The trials have tested kids getting their first dose at 5 months. And it's currently a 4-dose vaccine. So kids are getting the vaccine at 5 months, 6 months, and then 7 months. And then they get a booster shot 2 years later. So far, that booster shot seems to be really important for that more long-lasting immunity. So, in the conversations that we're having about boosters, that's fairly common across different types of vaccines for different diseases.
You can see that.
Questions in the chat that I want to. Oh, sorry. Let's get back to your question, Derek. But I think there are good questions here. One is, do people in the U.S. get malaria? And malaria is more endemic in other parts of the world, especially in sub-Saharan Africa and Asia. So it's important to think about because it's not very common in wealthier countries. And that's kind of shaped the research landscape around, the resources that we put into a disease like malaria. So there's kind of an interesting connection between who gets the disease and how many resources are targeted towards solving that problem. Derek, go ahead.
I was just going to ask though, couldn't we argue that whatever progress is made in this regard is good progress, even though its effectiveness is rated at 30%? I mean, that's 30% more than what we had before. And considering how widespread malaria is, that's a step in the right direction, right?
Absolutely, and I think that's the key thing to remember in sort of where the step that we're taking now. One is that it's better than not having any vaccine at all, right? But also to remember that it's still part of a whole set of tools that we can use in our fight against malaria. And so, there's a question that about some pills that you can take beforehand, and those pills, have some pretty bad side effects. My sister actually, has had gets really bad nightmares when she's taken those, and that's a fairly common side effect. So, those kinds of preventative pills aren't great, and of course, they don't last as long as a vaccine would. So that's that those pills aren't perfect, but there have been huge global efforts to just get simple things like mosquito netting to around the country. And those kinds of very simple interventions are really effective. And, we still need to keep those going.
Yeah. Are there no
vaccines? Yeah, just kind of part of the whole. Yeah.
Yeah, and you, Joshua, you just mentioned that some known side effects for the pills. Are there known side effects with the vaccine?
So far, it doesn't seem like there are any serious side effects that would complicate, the potential reach of the vaccine. But of course, with any new vaccine that gets rolled out, there's continuous monitoring about side effects that may emerge as we get into the millions and millions of people who get the vaccine. So we'll have more answers to that, I think, as time goes on.
So as the vaccine becomes more widely available, would one of the next things that we'd have to consider about this what the distribution channels are and how this gets equitably distributed around those countries that need it?
Yeah, you hit the nail on the head right there, right? That's the challenge. The good news is that there is a very robust childhood immunization program that's been rolled out in countries across the world. So there's infrastructure that already exists for getting these essential vaccines to kids. Like these have been set up in terms of fighting polio and other diseases like that. What's challenging about this particular vaccine, though, is at 4 doses, right? It's a different vaccination schedule. It's 4 doses. How do you get people to bring their kids back? So there's definitely some logistical challenges to consider. The last point that I make, as we try and wrap up this topic, is that we've been hearing so much about mRNA vaccines, and there's some potential for an mRNA vaccine for malaria. So this is really, I think, a turning point in vaccine development. There's already another vaccine in production, in testing in phase 2 trials that is up to 77% efficacy. And earlier this year, Pfizer and BioNTech, who produced one of the mRNA vaccines for COVID-19, announced that they're working on an mRNA vaccine for malaria that they hope to get into clinical trials by the end of 2022. So I think where we are today, it's a big deal that we have the first malaria vaccine. But I think what's really exciting is that I think we're going to be seeing much better vaccines happening much more quickly.
Okay, now before we jump away from this, just let me ask
what's your last thought, Derek?
and my last, I think this is fantastic. I think it's really great that this is beginning to emerge, because of course this is something that's very badly needed in these places. But I'm really intrigued by the idea of an mRNA vaccine. And I just want to make sure I understand this right. mRNA is this process in which you're essentially giving your body instructions for how to create the antibodies that would protect against this. Is that right?
That's right, because one of the challenges of making a malaria vaccine is getting that target to be something that the body can recognize. And in fact, this particular vaccine combines a malaria protein with part of the hepatitis B virus in order to deliver it in a way that's recognizable. And so there are some really cool options for thinking about how with an mRNA vaccine, where you're essentially just giving your body the instructions to build it yourself, maybe that solves some of those problems.
Cool. I love that idea. I really like that idea. Giving your body the instructions it needs to create the protection you'll need. Very cool. Yeah.
Daryl, any last thoughts from you?
No, I think we hit that in terms of this is the first step in what we're hoping will be further developments to advance this. We recognize, again, this is a global issue and has huge implications for populations around the world. And the fact of the matter, right, we've seen in the last year and a half or so with the advancements of mRNA technology, the power that there is in being able to more quickly develop treatments for some of these global diseases.
Yeah, no, I think we're on the cusp of something really, really exciting.
Yeah.
All right, we'll cross that out off the list. Derek, you're up next. Tell us about dark sky places.
Okay, so speaking of global impact, here's something that you probably never considered as a topic of global impact. You know that as the population on the planet continues to grow and urban areas grow, it looks like a lot of night illumination is needed for people to be able to function around these large urban areas at night. Of course, that makes perfect sense, right? It's dark, you want to get around, you need light. Well, as it turns out, all that extra lighting is beginning to have a detrimental effect on our ability to see the night sky. Think about it. If you live in an urban area where there's so much street light and building lighting, you might have recognized already that it has become more challenging to see some of the more subtle aspects of the night sky. Now, case in point is our very own galaxy, the Milky Way. Do you know, I've had people call me and ask why it is that today they can't see as many stars as they used to see when they were much younger. And after I probe around a little bit, I find out that they probably grew up in a more rural area or grew up at a time when there wasn't as much night light. Well, as it turns out, because of that expansion, a number of places around the world have determined that they really need to do something to protect the resource of the night sky. And in fact, there's an organization, the International Dark Sky Organization, that helps us figure out how to protect that resource. And the city of Pittsburgh has actually made a huge stride in this direction recently by voting in an ordinance in which they're going to change all of their city lighting over to lighting that's way more effective at doing a couple of things. And that is sort of putting the light where it really needs to be. I'll tell you what I mean by that in a second. And by reducing the amount of energy that they're using when they're illuminating the city. So let's go back to the first part, putting the light where it needs to be. In urban areas, we have a lot of street lighting, but as it turns out, there's also this really, really cool design element that's being used on skyscrapers, and that's uplighting. But if you think about it, a lot of that light that goes up the buildings actually then bleeds over into the night sky. And some of that street lighting is also uplighting. So now we're wasting energy and wasting lighting and making it more difficult to see the night sky. As it turns out, some people have been observing, and I've seen this too, that there are generations, possibly generations of kids that grow up in urban areas that never get to see what the night sky really looks like. So now what's beginning to happen is areas around the world are designating sites, designating areas, parks, vast tracts of land that are protected against night lighting. And these places are becoming what are known as dark sky reserves. And there is a dark sky reserve right here in Pennsylvania. It's called Cherry Springs State Park. And this is a place where it is intentionally planned to keep it as dark as possible at night so people can get out and look at the night sky. It's a pretty cool concept. I hate the idea that we're going in that direction, that we actually need to do this. But when you think about it, all kids should be able to see the Milky Way at night when they look out. And hopefully the addition of these dark sky preserves will help to make it possible for people to get to dark sky areas a lot quicker.
My first question is, like, if you think about, the preserve that you mentioned here in Pennsylvania versus like the bright lights of Philadelphia, how far away do you have to get?
That was going to be my question.
Right?
That's a
in terms of
really
like
good
getting
question.
people places, right?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And you know what? In the Philadelphia area, since we're a pretty major, urban area with Philadelphia, Camden, Wilmington, and the surrounding regions, it can take quite a bit of time to get away from this light. And in fact, I found that in order to escape really, you have to go about an hour outside of the area to do that. Right. And if you're in a dark sky area, I've even noticed this on the Pennsylvania Turnpike going up north, if you're about 40 miles outside of the city, you can still see the light dome of the city down to the southeast as you're coming down the parkway, down the turnpike. So, 45 minutes to an hour outside the city, sometimes that might not be accomplishable by some folks. And it's even been said that, communities of color sometimes suffer more than other communities because of the vast number of night lights and the brightness of that light. And even the color temperature of that light can be detrimental to health at night. It also affects animals like birds and things like that on migratory routes. So yeah, you can see this light pretty far out.
That's interesting. And you think about sort of urban planning and opportunities to create spaces to allow for these experiences. I think, for example, right here in our own home, we have Fairmount Park, right? And we have the Wissahickon and things of that nature. But I'm wondering if maybe there's a way to think about timing it so that you have, blocked hours, say from this time point to this time point, where you adjust the lighting to allow for people to have these experiences. But then I also think too, we're in a high density urban area, and thinking about other issues that related to security and all these kinds of things. Like, it's such a layered sort of set of factors here to really to be considered here. So yeah, it's fascinating though to think about it, because I guess we take for granted the fact that this is something that many people don't really have an opportunity to experience.
Yeah,
for
you're
everyone
right.
who's listening out there, I'm curious, have any of you experienced this, decreased visibility of the night sky over your lifetime? Or is there a place that you've been to where, you've really been, struck by how many stars you've been able to see? What's your dark sky place? But Derek, one thing that I was thinking about in terms of those kind of two scenarios that you laid out for us, looking at how cities are trying to, maybe make their lighting more targeted versus, and maybe it's a yes and, maybe it's not, it doesn't have to be either or, right? But this idea of like setting aside dark sky places almost kind of feels like we're throwing our hands up and saying, okay, well, dark skies for out there, where, you know, we can't do, how do we instead think about how can we also do better?
Mhm.
Well, you know, that's a really interesting point, because often when we talk about these mitigation efforts to redirect light, sometimes it seems as if this is coming from the point of view of the sky observers. And you know what, as it turns out, it's really just a beneficial, you know, side benefit, if you will, to something else that's way more important. And that is urban areas figuring out how to do a couple of things: how to provide more light where it's needed, and how to reduce the energy footprint of all the lighting that's being used. So there's a product called full cutoff lighting fixtures. And these are fixtures that can be used on street lights that direct all of that light down toward the street rather than up in the sky. And if you do things like that, it can reduce the expense to the municipality for having this kind of lighting, because you have more lighting where you need it. And that's a really important part, because if we think about, you know, our energy footprint overall, night lighting takes up a lot of cost in that and uses a lot of energy. So it really is beneficial to the community to redirect that lighting, to be more, you know, thoughtful about how to plan for night lighting, with a great side benefit of, hey, we can see the sky a little bit better.
So how do we reframe this as a win-win? Right?
Yeah, the way to reframe this as a win-win is that we all should talk to our communities about how we deploy night lighting. And the way to come at it seems to be, you know, it's really successful to say, hey, look, this is going to save our municipality money if we think about doing it this way. And then that frees up resources to do other things. Oh, by the way, it also helps to give kids this authentic science experience of being able to see the night sky. And don't we want our kids to grow up seeing what the Milky Way looks like? I mean, if you pull on the heartstrings, that always helps the cause. So that's a good way to, that's a good way to approach it. But it is really important that we think about that in all of our communities.
Yeah, and I think too, and Geoffrey, you asked the question before, if you can reflect on sort of your some dark sky experiences, and I have a feeling that Derek will relate to this, but one of my best memories was in Hawaii. I mean, it is unbelievable the amount of and the vastness of the sky that you can see there. I've also had some pretty remarkable experiences in my home state of New Mexico too. Where there's opportunities even within the city of Albuquerque, where you just can go, you know, a couple of miles from the city and be in a place where you can see the dark sky. So I'm relating to some of the comments that folks are saying here in the chat about some of the places that they've traveled to or where they like to go to observe the night sky.
And let me just mention what Diane Turnshek, who is a special faculty at Carnegie Mellon University, who was the co-author of the ordinance for Pennsylvania, said. She's been teaching astronomy out there for about 40 years. And what she said was that when she went out to a really dark sky location out in the Southwest, she felt as if she was being lifted up to the stars. The sky was so clear and the stars seemed to be so close. And a great expression for, you know, what it feels like to be under a dark sky like that. The kind of thing that, you know, we might want everybody to have an opportunity to experience.
Agree.
All right. Good take there.
Yeah, turn off your lights at night.
Yeah, turn off the lights at night.
And you know what, the other piece of this is that people should be able to, we have to help people understand how to differentiate between lighting at night used to prevent crime versus directed lighting that accomplishes the same thing for a lower cost and with greater efficiency.
Right, I think that's exactly right.
Clarifying that, yep.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, so thinking about, you know, how like, what is the purpose of light versus the value of dark?
Exactly.
Yeah,
that's an interesting way to think about it.
Great way to put that.
Yeah.
All right, well, we're gonna go from the dark of night to lightest paint.
I was
Take it away.
Talking about light and dark, yes. So I have actually a really interesting story to share and can't wait to discuss with the two of you and also with those who are watching and listening. So it turns out that scientists have created the world's widest paint. Now, for those of us who have seen paint, worked with paint, seen white paint, with the naked eye, it's really difficult to differentiate between what's white, whiter, whitest. So I kind of find that interesting that they've described this as ultra white paint. Now, why is it called ultra white paint? It's called ultra white paint because it is so white that it reflects solar radiation to up to about 98%. So scientists are really wowed by this particular phenomena, and they have some particular suggested uses for it. One is thinking about, I mentioned solar radiation. So if you think about global warming, you think about how we have these major temperature fluctuations in the winter and in the summer. And if you recall the summer we just left, it was absolutely 100% hotter than hot. And so if you can imagine having a paint that can reflect solar radiation up to 98%, and not only reflecting the radiation, but also cooling itself at the same time, which means that it's cooler than the surrounding areas that are not covered by this particular coating of ultra white paint. So scientists are suggesting, oh, this would be great to put on roofs, because in some ways it might be able to eliminate the need for air conditioning altogether, which would be absolutely phenomenal, because then you can think about energy savings there and the drain on our grid. So again, this is quite a phenomenal scientific feat, and it's actually rooted in BS.
Tell me more.
What do I mean by BS?
Because I've got some thoughts around the BS.
It's a comment, yeah, it's not BS, it's BS as in barium sulfate. So barium sulfate is found in many paints and in white paint in particular. It's a filler, but it also be one of the reasons why these scientists have been able to make this paint ultra white is because they're able to control for two factors. One, the concentration of barium sulfate in this paint, and then two, the particle sizes, different particle sizes. So they've suggested that the combination of these two factors enables this paint to be so reflective that it's able to get to such a high level of reflectivity. It's hard to say that word 5 times fast, but such a high level of reflectivity that it makes it potentially useful for energy savings.
That's fascinating.
Sounds great.
So what's the catch?
I want to know how widely available is barium sulfate. I mean,
so barium sulfate is used in cosmetics and paint. So it's as a compound, it's used quite a lot actually in industry. This particular paint, though, however, is still, I think they're working out some of the tweaks. It's not commercially available as of yet, but once it does become, commercially available, then of course one of the particular uses is, as I mentioned before, for coatings for roofs, again, to increase the reflectivity of solar radiation, therefore cooling the surface of the roofs, which then would ultimately reduce, or as they suggest, potentially even eliminate the need for air conditioning.
wow.
I mean, I think that's huge. I mean, we've seen how that affects, our lives here, even in terms of just like, school being let out because schools don't have air conditioning. And so, how could we solve the problem with this kind of technology?
Exactly. I was also too thinking like, well, what are some other practical uses for this? So that, roofing has been discussed, but I'm wondering if this is even something you could even put in for how you think about coating cars, right? Because if you have cars that are sitting in the heat,
Yeah.
therefore eliminate the need for having to power up your car with air conditioning and keep your car cool longer. So that I could think of other surfaces that suffer from the intensity of solar radiation as potential or other uses for this particular ultra white paint.
I have to say that this reminds me of an asteroid impact mitigation process or possibility that has been bandied around over the last decade or so. And it's a really interesting one. And it involves Bruce Willis and a team of astronauts in a rocket that is filled with, say, powdered sugar or flour, something white. And the idea is, the crew takes the spacecraft out to the incoming asteroid that's headed toward Earth, and you sprinkle this material on one side of the asteroid.
No.
Now, because of the difference in color, white on one side and dark on the other side, the differential heating will cause the asteroid to spin in such a way that it will slowly drift off course, off its intended course, and head someplace else. So now the Bruce Willis part, of course, that's all fantasy, but the concept itself is thought to be possible to actually have an effect. So there's another really interesting connection to the idea of this, changing heat gain by using reflectivity as a way to do that.
That's interesting.
So there's a question in the chat here that
you.
scientists are also working on creating the blackest black as well.
So I saw that too, and I'm thinking this is a really interesting, I'm thinking of a really interesting engineering experiment here, where you think about how we have our shades on our windows and we roll them up or close them, obviously to control light, but in some cases even to control the temperature, because the light coming in produces a lot of heat. So what if I may be giving a patent away, so hopefully credit for this. You
heard it here first.
You heard it here first, folks. Franklin Institute. But what if you did the same thing where you had like the shading that one is coated white and another one that's coated black. So in the summertime, you cover your roof with the white to reflect the sun. And then in the wintertime, you roll that back and you roll over the blackest black paint so that it can absorb the heat and therefore produce heat for your home. That sounds a little far-fetched and a little, sci-fi, but yes, that's where my mind was going.
You know what? Maybe not so much. I recall in my studies about Benjamin Franklin that at one time he conducted an experiment in his yard around his home in the winter on a snow-covered surface, in which he laid out one piece of white material and one piece of dark material. And he tested to see what would happen to the snow underneath. And what he discovered was that the snow under the dark material melted faster than the snow under the white material. So he was already thinking about how the darker material is not reflecting as much sunlight as the lighter material is. So maybe this goes back a bit further than we originally thought.
Good call. Interesting.
So I have to, your bad chemistry jokes notwithstanding. The BS about this that kind of caught my attention as I saw this, come through my Twitter feed, though, is that it felt like there was just, maybe a tiny bit of like hype around this. So I saw headlines like, and this is from, I think, PBS NewsHour, just to give credit here, but can the world's whitest paint save Earth? Like things like that. And, you also like the fact that, they're literally in the Guinness Book of World Records is a little weird.
Right.
But okay. But I guess I'm a little cautious about thinking that this particular technological solution might be, like the golden key or something like this, right? Because as we're thinking about our climate crisis, there are things that we can't reverse, right? There's habitat degradation, there's losing species that are going extinct. And where do we see this in terms of the bigger picture, right? There's a climate summit happening worldwide very soon, and how to tackle this important problem. What's our sense for how paint fits into that?
Well, you're right. I mean, for something like this to have a real effect, there would have to be a broad acceptance that this is something worth pursuing, right, and investing in. Right. And then two, you would have to think about scale. Coating one or two roofs in a given neighborhood isn't really going to make that much of a dent in the broader scheme. So this is something that would really need to be have very wide buy-in in consideration. Plus, I get even thinking too about like building codes and things of that nature, where you'd have to get buy-in from construction companies and from builders to agree to use this paint, as part of their construction process. So there's layers to this. We're really trying to think about impact at scale that need to be considered.
Derek, any last thoughts?
I was just going to say, now that I think about it, I wonder how this combines with the dark sky preserve idea, in that, if all the buildings' roofs are painted white, is that just reflecting more light back up into the night sky? These two things clash in some way.
Whoa. This is why science cannot work in a vacuum, right?
Lots to be considered, exactly. Yeah. But generally speaking, I think it's great that we are investigating all these different concepts in which we can put together a number of different elements that might be able to be of some use to us.
Yeah, there's some great comments coming through in terms of ideas that are being applied for different purposes, whether we're looking at other types of reflective coatings that that reduce heat absorption, or using white paint to minimize the heat waste from electronics. And so, even if we don't get to a point where we're painting every building white and thereby blinding the night sky, there's a lot of middle ground to explore in between. So really cool stuff. Again, I think the theme that we keep coming back to is how these technologies can't just stand on their own, right? We're looking at, how the science interacts with all of the decisions that we make as a society, whether it's, things like malaria vaccine and on the different tools that we have to use them against it, or whether we're looking at, these kinds of, material developments versus just where we build and how we like the places that we build. So, all right, well, that was fun.
It was.
I learned a lot. Hopefully you did too. Thanks everybody for joining us. We hope you will come back next month for our next episode, and feel free to drop some ideas on things that you're hearing out in the news that we should talk about. We'd love to hear what's on your mind. Thanks again for joining us, and have a great afternoon.
Bye, folks.
So long, everybody.